A few months ago, I raised some of the problems with the Australian housing market on this show. Well, sadly, those problems are only getting worse. Put simply, housing in our two biggest cities has become unaffordable for more of the working population at the same time as government drops the ball on public housing. Now, a new report by Dr. Cameron Murray and Josh Ryan Collins points out that real home prices across Australia have climbed 150% since the year 2000, 150%, but wages during the same period have gone up by less than a third. Now, Sydney and Melbourne, despite our vast landmass and small population, are now amongst the most expensive real estate hubs in the world. Now, there'll be some saying all of this is good news. Homeowners are getting rich. But are they? As Dr. Murray told me on the radio this week, among those who can afford homes, the increase in household debt-to-income ratio is increasing financial fragility, not to mention weighing on consumption. In other words, real estate is pushing Aussies into dangerous levels of debt whilst kneecapping the high street by sucking up discretionary spending. Now, obviously, that's costing jobs. But then there's the people who can't afford a house, those that need public housing to get that first roof over their head. Well, once upon a time, I think we did very well with social housing in this country, but we've lost our way. There are now over 140,000 Australians on various waiting lists for public housing. 140,000. Some people have told me they're facing a decade-long wait just for accommodation. Now, I'm strongly of the view that the money slated for HomeBuilder would have been better spent developing public housing rather than giving existing homeowners a reduction on their kitchen diner extensions. I know I'm not alone in that point of view. In short, we're now so deep in our housing obsession in this country that I doubt we'll ever really be able to climb out of it safely without a few knocks along the way. And whilst young Australians watch their dream of home ownership fade with escalating prices, others wait in vain for public housing that just isn't coming. The great Australian dream for many is now an hallucination at best. Well, let's see what the panel makes of that. Tanveer, what do you make, mate?
Well, look, public housing is very close to my day job, Michael. You know, a big part of our job is trying to get people accommodation, and it's a huge challenge. I saw this interesting statistic when I was kind of researching your editorial, Michael. Between 1996 and 2016, there was a 30% increase in residential dwellings. Guess how much public housing went up by? 4%. So that gives you a real good sense of the huge kind of need and gap in public housing. I think we can do a great deal more there. And the government is relying a lot on... They've got a national housing fund. They're really applying kind of super funds, and they're looking at all these different sort of private sector ways to try and fill that gap. But I'm not sure it's necessarily the way to go. In terms of your broader points about housing affordability, I mean, some of that may be affected considerably by coronavirus. I mean, we've had such high migration. We've had amongst the highest migration in the Western world. So that's been a huge driver. So that's going to have a big dip for a little while, which will certainly hurt housing prices. Much has been said about the taxing, and arguably, you know, when you look at it in global standards, I mean, our taxing is very favourable regarding investors. So, but we saw how politically fraught that is to take on in the last election, extremely difficult. One thing I find about Australia, and arguably this is only going to get worse with more people working from home, I have always found it, I think it's one of those places where everybody wants that kind of four-quarter block, and they're happy to go miles away from the city to get it. Whereas, you know, much of the world, they're quite happy to live in apartments and commute on public transport. Yeah. And part of that's about density of cities and stuff. Now, for a while, I thought, oh, maybe that's going to slowly change, but arguably it's only going to get worse if people are working from home more. They're going to want that bigger house out in the suburbs even more than ever. Yeah. So it will be interesting how the coronavirus bit, will this just be a blip in the housing debate? It's a national sport, isn't it, Michael? I mean, talking about real estate and housing, it'll be interesting whether this will be just a blip on the broader housing market. You know, in a year or two, we'll be back to, you know, ever-increasing prices and, you know, people bidding up, or will it have a more sustained impact on the housing market?
I suspect it won't be a blip. Well, I should say I expect it will be a blip because the political class never seem to want to see prices go down. Catherine, you're based there in the ACT. There's a lot of public housing in Canberra. But even
Indeed.
there, I think they've probably got the shortest waiting list of any area, but still, I mean, these enormous waiting lists all over the place, aren't there?
Indeed there are, and it's a real issue, Michael. One of the great cohering things of the Australian project has been aspirations for people to get a rung on that ladder to own a house. It was the great ballast of that middle class that Menzies talked about in his Forgotten People speech, and it was the ballast that has basically sustained centre-right governments since World War II. For those who have had a few rough deals in life, and I know plenty of people who've had the same background I've had in terms of mental health and substance issues, who've needed public housing either longer term or at least as an interim emergency measure. It is dire to have that kind of waiting list. I don't have a magic solution, but you wonder whether that isn't one area. I know we can't just keep on printing money and doing kind of a government as the lender of last resort on everything, but it strikes me that making serious inroads into construction of public housing for that backlog would be a very, very worthwhile thing to do, both in terms of providing skilled work for local workers and also solving a genuine social problem, because the last thing we want is that situation where we're stepping over our fellow Australians in the street. Most people don't choose to live that way. They get there through a series of bad body blows, and after this cliff that we're all hearing about with mortgage respite and job seeker drying up, it's going to be a chronic problem. So you've raised a very, very substantial matter.
Yeah, it will be a big problem. That's why I think I argued that I thought HomeBuilder was a missed opportunity. There was $600 million that could have gone to public housing construction and still had all of the tradies get work, which was the purpose of it, of course.
Totally agree.
Yeah. Now,
Totally
Sam,
agree.
of course, maybe I'm sounding a bit like a Labor guy here. You and I might be for the only time tonight in fierce agreement. What do you make of all of this?
Look, mate, I could not agree with you more. I could not agree with you more. For starters, on the HomeBuilder, look, this is a great myth out of this whole stimulatory debate. This is a great myth that has been persecuted by or propagated by the government, this $600 million figure. They're not going to spend a fraction of that. You know, to get access to that money, to qualify for that money, at this point in the economic cycle, that being recession, you need to go and spend $150,000 of your hard-earned renovating your kitchen, your bathroom, your whatever. That's a sizable whack. And I'm sorry, I just think it is a complete fabrication to say, and good on you for calling it out. Good on you for calling it out. But look, you're absolutely right. There's nothing about Australia's housing market that says it has to be so, okay? It takes a special kind of policy stupid on the most underpopulated continent on Earth to have one of the highest housing prices on Earth. I get why Manhattan is so high. I get why Hong Kong or Japan are so high. I cannot for the life of me, not for the life of me, Michael, understand why Australian housing market is so high, other than to look at what the drivers of these things are. What are the things that have led to this? And it is, as Tanvir nominated, things like negative gearing and capital gains tax. It is an underinvestment in public housing. But you know what? None of these problems are insurmountable. Every single one of these problems can be fixed if the political will is there from the government and the opposition to sit down and come to an agreement.
But part of the challenge also, Catherine, is the idea of decentralisation, isn't it? I mean, you're in Canberra, probably the only great example of decentralisation this country's ever achieved. Why can't we do another one? Is it because to make it work you've got to move a mass of the public servants somewhere to get it started, and that's not practical?
Look, there's a lot of talk about this, Michael. Again, some of it's grown out of the alternative work patterns that the pandemic has demanded. People are starting to say, well, I could grab a cottage in a regional city, move my family there. The Oz did a pretty good series on this a few weeks ago of youngish families who've moved to places like Orange, that sort of 30-ish demographic, quite like the university towns, because they've got a sort of a nightlife and culture that appeals to them. So I think a move to the regions, providing the connectivity is there to allow people to work remotely, that's an option for sure. It's one I've entertained myself, actually. I thought about moving back to my roots, Jonesy's old hometown, actually around Auckland in Queensland, looking for a small cottage in my latter years. But again, you've got to have access to employment, or you've got to have some flexibility in your working arrangement. I'll close on this. I don't want to take too much time, but we are distinct I'm with Sam on this. It doesn't have to be a partisan debate, mind you. I think the aspirational aspect of this is also a centre-right phenomenon. Where the fault line is between neoliberals and social conservatives. I want everyone in a home, whether it's social housing or whether it's their first home or whether it's the intergenerational transfer by bequest to get a family start. It gives them a social stake that is of enormous intangible benefit. But the one thing that I think we really do have to look at is the negative gearing. And I predicted that Shorten had bitten off more than he could chew, abolishing that. But I do think we've got to really start to look at the Great Australian Dream and say it's better to house more people than to have some people purely running places as essentially tax investments rather than fulfilling the primary purpose of home ownership. I think
Catherine,
we need to have a look at that.
Just to jump in there, and it is incumbent on me to, as a former Labor candidate and someone that ran in the last election and had a bit to do with that negative gearing policy, our aim was never to abolish negative gearing. Labor's aim was and policy was never to abolish it. All we were saying was that for everyone that was currently in the system, you could have access to that in perpetuity, forevermore, until you sold that house or got rid of it, whatever. And if you wanted to get access to it, it had to be on a new build. So it had to contribute to the housing market, building it up. So I don't think it is fair for Labor to ever go near this policy again until the Liberal Party goes there. You know, and I think COVID presents the opportunity to do that. But I don't think we can ever expect the Labor Party from opposition to do that again.
It will be very hard for a centre left.
I think that's valid, but I also think, Sam, it's incumbent on Labor to perhaps look at superannuation. You know, you've got people having compulsory amounts of their income locked up when probably a lot of them, if you ask them, would rather it was going towards a deposit on a house that they could get access to while they're trying to start a family, rather than locking it up well into their latter years. That'd be one area, I think, that there is an ideological fault line.
Yeah, and you know, I'm actually sympathetic to that argument. I once as young Labor president argued for that myself. The economics of it, when you actually model it out, just don't work. They just don't make sense.
Right.
Superannuation gives working people the opportunity for wealth creation that they've never had throughout history. So right now, you're able to retire if you're 50 or 60 or 70, having had 20 years or 30 years now of wealth creation, having had that money put aside and put to one side by your employer. It's your money, but it's put to one side. You get access to that money. All of a sudden, you've got this magical retirement. Now, I could not think of a policy worse designed to take money out of the pockets of young people and funnel it into the pockets of existing homeowners who are of an older generation. You could not design a better policy to rob young people of that money and pump up the housing market for old people. You just couldn't.
It would be better going into housing, and frankly, most of those funds, and very few people who've worked for a living in PAYE income earners are getting a big gold mine at the end of it. They're not in the same category as the self-funded retirees or people in prescribed benefit schemes. They're just not. So it has been one of the great myths. It was well-intentioned, but I think it failed to deliver. But we're unique almost in the world as well with this obsession with the quarter-acre block and also the idealised version of home ownership. I know when I've worked in the United States, which I did a good deal in the 1990s, people were bewildered that we thought it was normal to want to own a place. They were quite happy to be lifelong renters. It was much more widespread to rent apartments in their big metropolises and invest. They were more risk takers than we were, I think, as a species. So I don't know. There's no magic answers, but Michael's critique's valid, I think.
Good on you, Catherine. Thank you for the good discussion. I was just going to say before we move on, Sam, to your point, of course, when people take out their superannuation in retirement, a lot of people do take it out tax advantageous as a lump sum and pay off the home. So whether one does it at the end or one does it at the start of super collection, I'm not sure if it makes much difference. Catherine, we'll leave it there. Let's go and hear from you, eh?